All right, welcome to the election legislation webinar. We're going to start with a couple housekeeping items. First, if you could all make sure that your phones are muted so that we don't hear your typing or any sort of background noise, that would be great. Second, please avoid putting us on hold. If you have any hold music, everyone on the call will hear that music, so if you could avoid using the hold, that would be great. And finally, if you have any questions, please save them and wait till the end or type your question in, and we will get to you at that time. So to begin, we will start with some introductions.
Hi, this is Neil Kelly, the Registrar of Voters for Orange County, and happy to join the webinar. And we'll be splitting up the duties here between myself and Catherine Reedy, who you just heard do the introductions. And Catherine is the Manager of Community Engagement, but in that capacity, she also works as a legislative analyst here in the department. So we'll move forward here and talk about the agenda for the webinar itself. We are going to go over some important dates with respect to legislation and how the legislation is moving forward currently right now, mid-year, and election legislation trends in particular in California. Now, some of the trends we're going to talk about are really more nationwide, but there are some specific things to California that are unique, and we'll also talk about that. Proposition 14, which recently passed, is going to change fundamentally the way that people participate in primary elections and how those elections are conducted. So I think it's important that we discuss those issues here on the webinar, especially even though our primary just took place here in 2010, 2 years is not too far away for us to be talking about how Prop 14 will affect what you do. Then we'll go on to federal trends in election legislation. There are not as many federal trends right now as there has been in the past, only because Congress has been very busy dealing with other pressing issues such as the budget and military issues. And so elections, unlike in the past, maybe in a presidential cycle, there's just not as much activity at the federal level at the moment. Not to say that there isn't, but just something to bring up. Finally, we'll talk about the MOVE Act. This is an important addition to the UOCAVA, Uniformed Overseas and Military Voting Act, and this really, in particular, provides tremendous assistance to overseas voters and certainly our military voters that are overseas, and helps them get their ballots quicker and helps them return them to their election officials much quicker. And then finally, we'll talk about resources, not only the resources that we use here in the department to track legislation and elections, but something that you can use yourself to keep track of how election legislation moves through California and certainly at the national level. So we'll move on. We'll talk about important dates. So I'll turn this part over to Catherine.
All right, so there are a number of dates that we've got on our calendar right now that we're watching out for in the California legislature. The first date is June 15th. Now, this day has obviously passed. The budget bill is required to be passed by midnight on June 15th, but as has been the trend in recent years, that's simply not the case. So most likely they'll move to a work through the summer to get the budget bill passed. Summer recess will be taking place July 2nd to August 2nd, assuming that budget bill has been passed. So most likely that will be delayed if it happens at all. By August 21st, it's the last day for any bill to be passed. So that's really the deadline that we're looking at as far as any of these bills that we'll be discussing with you today. September 21st is the last day for the governor to sign or veto any of the bills that were passed by the legislature. And bills enacted on or before October 2nd will go into effect January 1st, 2011. So any of the bills we discussed today that end up passing and being signed by the governor will be effective January 1st, 2011, unless otherwise indicated by the bill. So those are our primary dates that we are watching. Next, we're going to move on to discuss some of the legislative trends in California, and Neil will take this over.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So before I get into some of the specific bills and actions that are being taken at the state level with respect to legislation, I want to talk to you about the codes that govern what we do here in our department. So as the Registrar of Voters, my main function and role is to maintain the voter registration rolls. That's a very important function, and to conduct all elections here in Orange County. We have other duties assigned to us, such as verifying petitions, which is a very important process. But for the most part, our real function here is maintaining voter registration rolls and conducting elections. So we have a specific election code that we must follow. And in this code itself, there are about 20,000 statutes that govern what we do. But like any body of law, it is not perfect. It's not a perfect system, but it works pretty well. And you have to think of the election code as a dynamic document because election laws change rapidly at times, and sometimes it takes a while for other legislation or statutes that are in place to catch up with those new laws. So it's something that we constantly work on and monitor and make sure that we're catching all of the new statutes that are put in place because that's very important. But there's also some other codes that we are responsible for monitoring and that we fall under when we're conducting elections. So I'll just kind of go through them very quickly. The government code, judicial code, the education code, and the civil code. Those are all codes that have various functions that we do here in the department that they cover. For example, candidate filing, judicial contests, school district elections, and then, of course, legal documents that we may deal with may fall under the civil code. So that just kind of gives you a good overview of all of the laws that we must abide by. And that doesn't even discuss, or we're not even touching on regulations, which is a whole other topic that we could actually have a whole new webinar on. So we'll pass that for right now. So let's talk about what's been happening currently in the session that we're in right now. And the first one up is AB 1681. This is a bill in conjunction with SB 1102 to conduct all mail ballot elections, and specifically in Yolo County as a pilot project. Now, I like to talk about this more in a global sense because mail ballot elections have been discussed at the legislative level for years, and when I say years, actually decades. The permanent vote by mail statute was enacted in 2002, and ever since that time there's been a lot of discussion about moving all California voters to a mandatory vote by mail system. It's failed consistently, and there's a variety of reasons that it's failed, mainly political and something we don't get into from an administrative standpoint. But this one looks like it has a little bit of legs, perhaps, and it may be that Yolo County would be able to conduct a all-mail ballot election as a test. Now, the idea, as any pilot program transpires here in the state, we usually see that transition into permanent statutes, but maybe not the case here because mail ballot elections still have a lot of discussion at the state level that's going to take place before we ever see them statewide. And but we'll keep an eye on this. This is an important bill. Next up are 17-year-old registrations. That's ACA 2 and AB 30, two separate bills. Now, AB 30 for voter registration will not take place for the 17-year-olds until we get the statewide voter database in place. And that's something that is tentatively scheduled for the end of 2011. However, recently the state is now going through a second RFP process for that voter registration system, so it remains to be seen what's going to happen here by the end of 2011, but we'll certainly keep our eye on that. What we do here in Orange County, though, that I think it's important to note, especially for people that register individuals out in the county, is if somebody is 17, you can still go ahead and fill out the form. That individual can list their birth date, obviously, on the form, fill it out just as though they're registering to vote, and we hold those registrations. We don't put them in the voter registration system. That would be contrary to law. But what we do is we hold them in place, and then if they're going to be 18 by the next election, then we go ahead and enter them at the time that they're 18. So this allows somebody to, let's say they're graduating from high school and they're going to be 18 by the November election, and they register now. We hold on to that registration, and then they're good to go for the November election. So we'll keep a close eye on these, and obviously AB 30, that's going to come up on us after the statewide voter database goes into effect. Next up is something near and dear to my heart, and that is AB 1769. In particular for us because we had the special election, the 72nd Assembly District special election, both the primary and the general take place last year, and then in January of this year. And elections are expensive. Now, the majority of costs that are focused with elections are labor, postage, and printing. That makes up the majority of our budget right there. So we're always looking to get reimbursed for these costs because they do come out of the general fund here in the county, and it's important that the state and the federal government reimburse the county for elections that essentially, they're responsible for. Now, however, the problem is with the budget situation, the budget climate, getting reimbursement from the state is a difficult proposition because there are obviously competing interests right now, and it's very difficult to get anything passed that is requiring or asking for reimbursement. SB 994 there is another example, and that would be where jurisdictions are reimbursed for, I believe, Senate vacancies. So again, both of these we're keeping an eye on. It looks like they're both dead, though, for the most part for this session. So we'll move on to AB 1717. And this is an important bill because this would allow individuals to opt out of receiving the sample ballot. Now, when I just spoke a few minutes ago about costs in elections, sample ballots are a big chunk of those costs because you're talking about printing a flat piece of material that is fairly expensive to mail, and we're required under California law to mail a sample ballot to every single voter in Orange County. This would allow a voter to opt out of receiving the sample ballot and instead would allow them to receive them by email or access them on our website. Here in Orange County, unlike some other counties in the state, we have all of our sample ballots online, and any voter now could go on, type in their address, and their sample ballot would pop up for them. So if they lost it, for example, when it came in the mail, they could still do that. We're already in place to have that conducted here in Orange County. But I think it's an important thing because what would happen is you'd still go through an election cycle. So what you'd have to do is have a full election conducted. People would be able to opt out of receiving that sample ballot. And then in the next cycle, that's where you start saving your money because now you don't have to print those sample ballots for those people who opted out. So again, we're keeping an eye on this as it continues to move forward. SB 1140 is voter registration, and SB 1140, this would allow someone to register to vote and immediately vote on election day, essentially same-day registration. Now, this is something that takes place in other states in the country, such as Ohio, has same-day registration. Many other states do. This one has been a little bit controversial in California because there's obviously different viewpoints on whether individuals should be allowed to register on the same day as the election, because you want to make sure that those registrations are valid. There would be mechanisms in place to make sure that they're valid, but again, I think this one's going to be interesting to see how this moves forward. The Secretary of State was also looking at a similar bill and moving that forward through the legislature, but that's on hold at the moment as well. SB 2732, which is legislative or congressional election instant runoff voting. The only thing I want to say about this is this has come up several times. San Francisco uses an instant runoff system already as part of their elections, but it would be very difficult for us to implement instant runoff voting with our current voting system and the way that it's configured. Doesn't mean that we couldn't do it, but what would happen is that we would have to reconfigure the way that our voting system tallies votes, and it would be somewhat of a difficult proposition to be able to conduct instant runoff elections. But again, this has been a popular thing that's been coming up almost every session, at least for some time. So we'll see what happens with this as well. On to Proposition 14. Now, Proposition 14 passed, and this is going to be something that's going to be coming up here on us very quickly as we prepare for the 2012 primary season. And essentially what this is allowing people to do is to go in and cast a vote for whoever they want. Now, the way that it has been in the past is for a primary, you register to vote, and you indicate your party preference. Let's say it's Republican, Democrat, Green Party, Peace and Freedom, doesn't matter what it is, a qualified party here in California. And then you are allowed to vote in that primary election for that party. As an example, in some elections, you may have contests. For example, Peace and Freedom may not put forward any candidates, so if you're a Peace and Freedom registered voter, you may not have any of those candidates to vote on, therefore you're voting what's essentially a nonpartisan ballot. What's also happened in the past is because the primary system it's essentially the election for the parties. That's the way we have to think about it. And those parties have the legal right to not allow crossover voters to vote in their primary. So, for example, if you registered to vote as a declined to state voter and you did not indicate any party affiliation, when the primary election comes up, about 6 months before the election, every party has to indicate whether they will allow those declined to state voters to vote in their election. In 2008, the Republicans opted out and did not allow declined to state voters to vote in the presidential primary election, which was interesting because we had a lot of calls on that, and people just want to be able to vote for whoever they want. This is essentially the top two candidates would move forward out of the primary, and it's very similar to what Washington State did recently. And Washington State did this exact same open primary, and it was challenged and went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the Washington State open primary. So it'll be interesting to see if that's tested here in California as well. Voters are going to be able to vote for the candidate of their choice regardless of the political affiliation. So you'll be able to go in and you'll have an open ballot and you'll be able to choose whoever you want to vote for. You can declare a party preference upon filing if you're a candidate, which is going to appear on the ballot, but essentially you wouldn't have to do that now because what's going to happen is those top two vote getters move forward to the general election. The only partisan elections that will take place in a primary would be for presidential candidates and party central committee contests. So what you're going to see is a ballot that's going to have all of those on the left-hand side, and you'd see president, vice president, et cetera, and the parties listed. And then on the right-hand side of the ballot, you would see all the other offices that now would not be specific to a party and would be open for any voter to vote on. The Superintendent of Public Instruction office was it was actually noted in Proposition 14 that that would be a nonpartisan office, so that's something that would still be on the ballot as nonpartisan. And this measure is going to become operative on January 1st of 2011. So essentially we're going to see it for the 2012 election cycle. We are currently right now looking in detail at Prop 14 and the responsibilities that will be put on us under this new statute, and we'll keep you posted on what's going to happen in the future. We're going to develop a committee here internal to the office to study this and make sure that we're covering all of our bases. So that's it on Prop 14, and now I'm going to turn it over. Actually, no, I'm going to have Catherine talk about this right here. So we'll talk about election legislation trends.
Okay, so we've already discussed AB 1769, which was our election reimbursement bill. And as Neil said, with the current state of the budget, it's a little bit difficult to get anything like that to pass. However, we do have another proposal, AB 2154, that's looking good. This would allow a voter to request a vote-by-mail application over the telephone. Now, currently, an individual can request a vote-by-mail ballot on our website, or they can come into our office and fill out a form. But we haven't had a way until, if this bill passes, that would allow us to take that request over the phone and process it. This was spurred really by just out of a need to better serve the voters of Orange County. Every election we receive phone calls, and it's always unfortunate that we have to tell them that we're unable to process that request over the phone and to say, you have to access our website or come into the office, which isn't the most convenient for some voters. So 2154, if it passes, will go a long way in helping with that. Now moving on to a couple miscellaneous bills, AB 2023, election results. This would authorize the Secretary of State to establish a post-canvass risk-limiting audit pilot program in 5 or more voluntary participating counties, which would be for the purpose of verifying the accuracy of election results. Post-election audits are a very popular and common topic that we often see in the legislature, and this one is moving forward, so we'll be waiting to see the results of this one here.
And let me just add too there, Catherine, that the Election Systems Commission, which is the national body responsible for federal elections and overseeing elections in the country, has some money right now through a grant program that they will be pushing down to local jurisdictions in the states for looking for creative ways to conduct audits post-election. So I think this kind of goes hand in hand with what you're discussing there.
Yeah, exactly. AB 2101, elections prohibiting payments. This was really spurred out of a feeling that signature gatherers who are hired to collect signatures for petitions, you hear stories from time to time about voters being misled into signing petitions that they don't support, or being misled into signing multiple petitions. This would simply prohibit a person who was convicted of engaging in these sorts of activities. It would prohibit them from receiving money for either assisting a person to register to vote or for gathering signatures. So it's a way that we would be able to take action and ensure that if a person is signing a petition, that individual who's collecting that signature doesn't have any sort of history of any sort of illegal behavior on this topic. Similar provisions have been enacted in Arizona and Oregon, and they prohibit petition circulators who are convicted of fraud from receiving money for doing so in the future. AB 2616, elections vote by mail. This would establish a system where an individual could determine if their vote by mail ballot had been counted, and if not, the reason why. And it would require counties to have an online portal for a person to access this information, or a telephone number that they could call. Here in Orange County, we already have that set up on our website, so for us, this is one that we're already in compliance with if it does move forward and pass. And finally, SB 970, pre-election day voting. This bill has gone through a number of phases this session. It originally started out where 4 college campuses within the UC and CSU systems would establish essentially early voting locations on campuses. As it currently stands, the bill is now down to 2 college campuses, one within the UC system and one within CSU, where election officials could set up early voting on campuses for students. It was enacted, or it was created simply out of a desire to increase youth involvement in elections and increase student involvement. However, with the amendments that have taken place, it's really just permitting early voting on college campuses and encouraging it for election officials who would have the option or not to enact this.
Let me just jump up before we leave the screen here on AB 2154. I think it's an important point to bring up. This was a bill that we brought forward, as you can see on the screen there. And when we have our phone bank set up and we receive calls from the public, they're really top 3 phone calls that we get all the time. It's pretty consistent. Where's my poll site? I'd like to know where my vote by mail ballot is, and can I apply for a vote by mail ballot? And under current law, we have to tell the voter to please hang up the phone. You can go online and make an application, or you can go ahead and fax one into us, etc. But we have that voter on the telephone, and that's why we brought forward this proposal. And there's been a lot of discussion about security and making sure that's the voter who's calling in. It's actually the best time to do the application, because our operators and agents have that screen open and see the voter's information right in front of them, and can ask the voter questions that only the voter would know, that we can determine that that's that individual. I'll give you an example, an analogy of a credit card, for example. When you call in, they're going to ask you questions, security questions, to verify who you are, that you're the individual in possession of that card, and that it's your card. Same thing here on the voting side. It's important. We want to make sure that the right ballot goes to the right individual, and we have those security measures in place. So we're hopeful that this continues to move forward.
Definitely. Okay, so we'll move on now to federal trends in election legislation. As Neil mentioned, the primary thing that we're seeing right now is legislation that would sort of expand the rights of our military and overseas voters to ensure that ballots are received on time, that they have the ability to register to vote, that they have the ability to mail back their ballot in a way that's convenient to them. So we'll review some of the details of the MOVE Act. The MOVE Act was signed on October 28, 2009 by the President, and it was part of the National Defense Authorization Act. Now the main components of the MOVE Act do go into effect at the end of this year. There are some components that won't start until next year, but the majority of this is ready to go for the November 2010 election. So the first thing has to do with ballot and election material transmission. And before I actually start, I should say that the state of California already has very supportive laws in terms of our military and overseas voters. So there are very few changes that the California counties would need to make in order to be in compliance with the MOVE Act. Most of this is already in place. So the first thing is allowing UOCAVA voters to request and for the state to send, both by mail and electronically, applications for voter registration, vote-by-mail applications, and finally vote-by-mail ballots. What we mean by electronically, that would include fax, email, and any sort of web-based application. Ballots must be transmitted at least 45 days before an election. This is something we already currently do at 60 days out. So we are in compliance with this component of the Act. No postage is needed. Again, this is something that we already do here in Orange County. And in the Act, they emphasize the right to privacy in voting, as well as in the transmission of these applications and these ballots. So to the extent that it's possible with a fax machine or with any sort of electronic communication, it's important that the overseas voter is able to complete their forms and turn them in with as much privacy as is possible. There are a number of duties that a presidential designee will be responsible for on the federal level. They will be responsible for establishing procedures for collecting and delivering ballots to the local counties during general elections for federal office. They're required to work with the U.S. postal system to ensure that these ballots are delivered on time. And the deadline that the ballots would need to be collected is noon the 7th day prior to the general election. In order to ensure that our overseas and military voters are aware of the MOVE Act and the various components of it, the presidential designee would be in charge of conducting outreach and education to our overseas voters so that they fully understand what their options are, how they're able to request and submit their ballots in order to have them counted and returned in a timely manner. And finally, they're responsible for establishing pilot programs that would test new election technologies to better serve our overseas voters, whether that be some sort of online web portal or email system. They're going to be looking into different programs and testing them out to see what's going to work best and be most convenient for our overseas voters. There are a number of state responsibilities. Many of these we're already following and are already our procedure. A state is not able to refuse to process a voter registration form, vote-by-mail application, or marked ballot because of a number of different things, such as notarization requirements, because of restrictions on paper type, the weight, the size, as well as the envelope type. And we have a policy of not refusing that ballots on the basis of those things anyway, so we're good to go on those. The state is also responsible for establishing a free access system that would allow a UOCAVA voter to check to see if their ballot was received. As we were discussing earlier in the California legislation, Orange County is already on board for this. A person can already go on our website and check to see if their ballot was received and sort of what the status is of that vote-by-mail ballot. The use of the single application for subsequent elections was repealed. Now what this means is typically before the MOVE Act was passed, an overseas voter could fill out an application that would allow them to be a vote-by-mail voter for the following two federal elections. This has been repealed. The reason for this was that they felt that there were a lot of ballots being returned with the wrong address. Because our overseas voters, they tend to be very mobile, their address may be changing on a regular basis, so while it may have been current when they initially submitted their form, a couple years later at the next election they may have moved and they're not receiving their ballot. So this is really in an attempt to ensure that we have the most up-to-date contact information for that voter so that when we're sending and receiving their ballot or vote-by-mail application that we have the absolute most current information available and hopefully to reduce the number of ballots that are returned undeliverable. And finally, the federal write-in ballot has been expanded for use beyond simply just general elections. They're now available for use in special, primary, and runoff elections for federal office. So the overall feeling behind the MOVE Act was really to ensure that our overseas voters have access to all of the services that they need to sort of remove any sort of challenges or difficulties that they may face and to try and make it so that all of the services that we provide for people who are here in Orange County are just as accessible to those overseas.
Let me talk just real quickly about a couple items with respect to the MOVE Act. The Federal Voting Assistance Program is a federal agency that is a division of the Pentagon, and they are charged with overseeing UOCAVA voting here in this country. That includes military voters as well as citizens, non-military voters who are either permanently overseas or temporarily overseas. We work very closely with the Federal Voting Assistance Program and making sure that we're in compliance. One of the things we're going to do here in Orange County, and it's going to be here in the next few weeks, we'll be launching a military portal as well as a civilian portal for individuals who are overseas so that they can do a number of things that we're not required to do, and we're going to do them to help voters. For example, military voters often are concerned about the security of their email, and depending on the type of email that they use, they may be hesitant to provide that, and then that's a good way for us to get their ballots to them quickly. We're going to provide a portal that military voters can enter an email address, and we keep it off of the voter registration rolls so that it does not become public, and they can be assured that their email is secure, and we're not going to share that. In addition, we're going to have a marking system. Now, let me just describe here quickly. Federal Voting Assistance Program launched a program for a ballot marking system that would be electronic. So a voter, for example, in Afghanistan who may be accessing an online system would be able to open up a ballot, mark that ballot, and then electronically it's transmitted back to the local election official. California is not going to participate in that program, and in fact there's only about 20 states in the union right now that will be participating in that program. But what we're going to do here in Orange County is a voter will be able to go online, type in their residence address, and it will pull up their sample ballot for them, and we will parse out those contests that they're not eligible to vote on. So for example, if you're permanently overseas, you're only able to vote on federal contests. You're not going to be able to vote on local contests. So a voter will be able to print that out, vote that sample ballot, and send it back to us. We'll also have an envelope template online that they can download and tape it right to the front of an envelope and put it in the mail, and it's off to us very quickly. That's just a few examples of the things that we're going to be including in the military portal, which will be coming up soon and will help us to maintain compliance with the MOVE Act and go beyond that as well. So just some additional information for our overseas voters.
Great. So finally, some resources that we use here in the office to track legislation that I think would be very helpful for you as well if you're interested in doing that sort of thing. We'll start with the California State Legislature website. That's going to link you to the Assembly, the Senate. It's going to actually link you to the second item on that resource list there, bill information. Now this is an important website that you can access through the California State Legislature website. And this one is going to allow you to sign up to receive notifications if you'd like about a bill that might be of interest. You can subscribe to that and they'll send you an email update as changes occur. You'll be able to see the status of various bills, what committees they're scheduled for, bill history, different amendments that may have been made. You can pull up all that information on that second item there, the bill information website. So that's a great one. The third item there is Total Capital. It's actually it's really just a portal of news and blog and legislative information. They pull articles from all different websites and all different news sources, so it's really a good sort of one-stop legislative information portal. In addition to news and blogs, they have a legislative calendar that will tell you the day's events. It'll tell you what bills are being heard in what committees. So it's a good source to get a sort of big picture of what's going on that day in the California legislature. Obviously, the California Secretary of State website is a great one. They've got a lot of information up there dealing with really every aspect of elections, so that's always a good one to visit. The Library of Congress website is where you're going to want to visit if you're interested in federal election law. You can search through their website and pull up any bill information just as you would with the California website. You can track the bills, you can see what their status is, what committees they're in, and sort of what actions have been taken on various federal legislation. And finally, Cal Channel is a great website. It allows you to actually watch the legislature in action. So you can go on there, and every day they broadcast live press conferences, floor sessions, committee meetings, anything that's coming out of the state of California, you can usually access on the Cal Channel. and they also archive their videos. So if you miss it, you can go back and watch, and it really is, it's a good resource because it allows you to get just absolutely up-to-date, the most up-to-date information available. Whereas if you were looking at the bill information, you know, there's usually a day or two lag on that. But CalChannel will allow you to follow it right up to the minute. So those are some of the resources that we use here in the office and that you can use as well at home that will allow you to track legislation and see what's going on in California.
So on behalf of myself and Catherine, I want to thank you for participating in our webinar. And if you're watching this on a replay, you can always feel free to contact us at any time. Our contact information is up there on the screen, and you can either email us or feel free to call us directly. So again, thank you very much. We look forward to your participation in future webinars, and on behalf of everyone here at the Orange County Registrar of Voters office, thanks for your interest in elections.